Hello, everybody. Is this thing, I want to say, is this thing on? Is this on? So hard to tell. Stephen told me that 12:03 is the appropriate time to start these things, so I'm sorry to be cutting off conversation, but I first just want to say how wonderful it is to see such an incredible turnout for the last week of school, the last week of the semester, I've been on leave this spring. I think it's post classes, at the end of classes. Clearly, Ike is a big selling point. It's with great pleasure that I welcome here today Professor William Hitchcock, who is here to talk with us about Ike, to talk on the age of Eisenhower, strategic patience, and the Cold War in the 1950s. Professor Hitchcock is Professor of History at the University of Virginia and the Randolph P. Compton Professor at UVA's Miller Center. His work and teaching focus on the international, diplomatic, and military history of the 20th century, in particular the era of the World Wars and the Cold War. He has written widely on transatlantic relations, on the politics of the 1950s, and on European history and politics. He has taught at Yale, Wellesley, and Temple before landing at the University of Virginia, has published numerous edited volumes that I will not detail here, and now 4 monographs, making some of us look bad, beginning with France Restored, Cold War Diplomacy and the Quest for Leadership in Europe, continuing with The Struggle for Europe, The Turbulent History of a Divided Continent, 1945 to the present, then the Pulitzer Prize finalist, I keep wanting to say Pulitzer Prize winner, but just a finalist, the Bitter Roads to Freedom, A New History of the Liberation of Europe, and now, of course, the hot off the presses, The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s. I would love to be able to proudly wave before all of you a copy of the book, but my copy is currently being devoured by my father in New York, my octogenarian father, who is clearly Will's target audience. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Professor Hitchcock to Ohio State and to the Mershon Center.
Thank you very much. It is lovely to be back. I am a proud graduate of Kenyon College, so I spent quite a bit of time in Ohio, and when I was at Kenyon, I used to come down to Ohio State to, eat pizza or find, food that wasn't from the cafeteria, because Columbus was the center of the universe, and we were out on the little satellites, and maybe that's still how it is for Kenyon students, I don't know. But it's great to be here, and great to be able to spend the day with my dear friend, Dr. Jennifer Siegel, who has been a friend of mine since, some years ago we first met. So you're all so lucky to have her amongst you. Well, I've written a book called The Age of Eisenhower, America and the World in the 1950s, and I want to say a few general things about the book to frame it for you, tell you about it, and just give you a fairly short summary of its principal points. And then I'm going to shift, and I'm going to trot out an idea that I have that's not in the book, drawn from the book, and see if this room of sort of security policy experts buys it. And I'll be delighted to know if you don't buy it, then I won't talk about it anymore. But if you do, I'll try to write it up as an article. So about 8 years ago, I found myself writing a book about Dwight Eisenhower, and I have to say I was really surprised to find myself doing that, because I had never worked on U.S. presidents before. I had not worked on U.S. history before. I had recently finished a book on the liberation of Europe at the end of World War II that focused principally on the small towns of Western Europe during the liberation, the last year of the war, and it was a really depressing book. I got to the end of the proofs, and I thought to myself, my God, what have I done? This is the most depressing book I've ever read. And many other people told me the same thing. And I think what I was doing was that I wanted a change of method. I wanted a change of approach. I was tempted by biography. I wanted to get back into the Cold War. So in consultation with an editor, I thought, why not Eisenhower? So I got drawn into the Eisenhower years, and that's the short story of the origins of this book. As you know, a lot of other historians beat me to it. There are a lot of books about the Eisenhower years, and especially his national security and foreign policies. And I read most of this work. In fact, I think I've read just about all of it. And what emerged from it, my reading before I started research, was the observation that there was really very good monographic literature written by scholars like you on a variety of topics in the 1950s. But in general, the biographies were not very good. Sorry, maybe there's half a dozen Eisenhower biographers here today. I only know that I'm here, but I will say I think that the biographical studies of Eisenhower as president tended to be written by journalists, tended to be written by scholars, or not scholars, but you know, what shall I call them? Writers, biographers. And that's not to say that they weren't good books to read, but they tend to be anecdotal, they tend to run chronologically without a break, and they miss a lot of the research that is available, that the kind of thing that scholars are most interested in. And so there was an enormous gap between the monographs and the biographies. And I wanted to use this opportunity to try to see if I couldn't blend the two. So this is a biography. I've written a biographical study of President Eisenhower, not his World War II years principally. Don't appear much in the book, a little bit at the beginning. But it is, I went at it as a historian would. I spent a lot of time in the archives. I read everything I possibly could get my hands on, and I built the book around a series of problems, key issues in Eisenhower's life. One obvious and essential difference between a biography and a work of history, note, those of you who might one day want to write a biography, is that historians make arguments and biographers often don't. So did I do that? Yes, I tried to do that. I tried to stay with my historian roots. The argument that I make in the book is that Eisenhower was not just a skilled leader. In fact, I think he was a gifted leader. I know it sounds like I'm a biographer, but really that's part of the story. He really was enormously skilled. But that, most important, his presidency mattered in shaping modern America. In fact, the argument that I make in the book is that Eisenhower was one of the most consequential of post-war presidents. Consequential is the word that I use. I don't think he was transformative, but I'm willing to go with consequential. He mattered. He shaped American public life, politics, and diplomacy, both foreign and abroad. I think, and the argument is actually in the title, that we can call the period from 1945, the death of Franklin Roosevelt, to the death of John Kennedy, from 1945 to 1963, the age of Eisenhower. He dominated the country, its politics, in that period as no other person could do or did. So what I want to do is just run through 3 examples of the ways in which Eisenhower was consequential, and then I will shift gears and talk a little bit about my theory about his Cold War strategy. First, let me just give you 3 ways that I think he was consequential. The first one, Eisenhower built and legitimated the warfare state that waged and then finally won the Cold War. And he did more than merely cause the warfare state to be built. He asserted that the United States needed a permanent peacetime warfare state. Permanent and peacetime warfare state. That's something quite new. That's something quite new that Eisenhower did. It emerged in the Truman years, but it became legitimated as a peacetime policy under Eisenhower. So the basic national security argument of our own time that U.S. interests and values can only be achieved with a global presence, a global military economic presence, a security presence, an intelligence presence, that is a product of the age of Eisenhower. Just let me tell you what he did. Tot it all up. Under Eisenhower's direction, the United States built a vast apparatus of continental defense, including an integrated early warning radar system, a massive strategic bomber capability, the first class of ICBMs, the Atlas and the Titan missiles, the Polaris missile placed on submarines, and the U.S. deployed intermediate and short-range missiles on the soil of many overseas allies in Europe and Asia. All right, so that's one. And that's a gigantic undertaking of enormous consequence to the infrastructure, the economics, the defense, the industry of our country. In doing all this, Eisenhower did not, as is often asserted, slash the defense budget. Yes, he brought it down from the extraordinary highs of 1952-53 in the Korean War. But in his years in office, the United States spent about 10% of its GDP, 10% of its GDP every year on defense spending. Today it's about 3.5%. But Eisenhower's years in office were a peacetime period in office. So an extraordinary outlay of defense spending in 8 years of global peace. That is a higher percentage than any peacetime administration before or since. So something is unusual, is remarkable about that. Of course, Eisenhower also urgently built out the covert operations and secret intelligence gathering capabilities of the CIA. He transformed what had been a pretty amateur operation that basically analyzed intelligence that was gathered by the military services into a much more ambitious, much more aggressive global agency that plotted coups in foreign countries, designed assassinations, undertook sabotage, installed intelligence networks around the world. The U-2 spy plane, arguably one of the great coups of intelligence of the Cold War, he championed that. And of course, by placing the Corona spy satellite in space and having it work by 1960, he began the militarization of space. All of these things Eisenhower personally approved, engaged with, pored over the details, was personally engaged with all the way through. So just in this one area, Eisenhower was clearly a consequential figure who shaped not just his decade, but indeed the rest of the Cold War. The Cold War apparatus that the United States used to wage and win the Cold War was created and defined by Dwight Eisenhower. That's consequential number one. Number two, the second way, domestic politics. I know we're all foreign policy experts here, but I want to talk a bit about that. Eisenhower tried very hard to craft a middle ground in American politics in the 1950s. We do tend to forget, at least young people that I talk to all the time tend to forget, that American politics between the 20s and the 1950s was extraordinarily partisan, with the pendulum swinging rapidly back and forth between very, very different alternative ideas of how America should be governed. The 20s era and even later, the Republican Party was more or less stuck in the sort of somewhat Neanderthal era of Harding and Coolidge and Hoover and Taft, while the Democrats under Roosevelt and Truman had championed an active interventionist and expansive federal government. And by the 1950s, many Americans had become anxious about the scale and the scope of the federal government. And Harry Truman, by 1952, despite what David McCullough told you, was among the most unpopular presidents in American history. So the pendulum kept swinging, and it was harder and harder to carve out a middle ground, Truman being very partisan. Eisenhower tried to halt the pendulum right in the center. His idea of government was that it should serve as a moderating force in American life, assisting citizens when they needed help, leveling the playing field, sort of shielding citizens from the harsh burdens of capitalism. Eisenhower believed in Social Security, for example, because after all, you have to work all of your life and pay into it before it would pay you out at the end. He believed the government had a role to play, enforcing laws and rules and helping the least fortunate through times of crisis. He believed in investing in infrastructure, of course, famously the Eisenhower Highway Program. But true to his Republican roots, he was always a careful steward of the nation's budget, and Eisenhower balanced 3 budgets out of 8, which, let's just be honest, is a remarkable achievement in the post-war era. His own party bucked against this program of moderation. But I think he did succeed in making the GOP, at the very least, internationalist. When we think of Robert Taft's view of the world circa 1940 and compare it to Eisenhower's and then the subsequent Republican leaders, we can see that Eisenhower legitimated internationalism in the GOP. To be an Eisenhower Republican was a legitimate badge of honor for some in that party, at least until the Reagan Revolution. Obviously, he did not transform the Republican Party into a moderate party, and we can talk about why. Now, his insistence on moderation has led a lot of scholars to say that Eisenhower didn't understand what the president was really supposed to do. Didn't really understand the powers of the presidency. He didn't seek to be transformative. He didn't grab a hold of the great social and political crises of his time and seek to transform them. And the one area where he gets a lot of criticism is in the realm of civil rights. Ike was a day late and a dollar short, according to pretty much everybody. Now, this is a subject I devote a great deal of attention to in the book because I felt it was important to get it right. Did Eisenhower help or harm or do nothing on civil rights? My assessment is that on civil rights, Eisenhower had periods of what I call sort of sudden wakefulness where he seemed suddenly engaged in the problem of civil rights. And the period 1953 to 1954 is one of them. We get the desegregation of Washington, D.C. and its eating establishments. We get the appointment of Earl Warren. We get the Brown versus Board decision, all of which Eisenhower knew exactly what he was doing. Don't let anyone con you into thinking he didn't like Earl Warren. He knew what Earl Warren was going to do. He really did. He wasn't stupid. So there's a period of wakefulness in the early period, then a period of withdrawal and reconsideration. Then a sudden period of wakefulness again in 1957, the passage of the 1957 Civil Rights Act, and of course the intervention in Little Rock. So Eisenhower, we see this kind of period of engagement and a period of withdrawal. Period of engagement and a period of withdrawal. He has a lot of friends in the South. Eisenhower grew up in Kansas. He didn't understand the crisis of black life in America. He worked his entire life in the segregated United States military. This was not a field he understood or was well equipped to deal with. He vacationed all the time at Augusta, which didn't allow women or African Americans until the very end of the 20th century. So I'm interested in this problem. I'm interested in a president who has to confront an issue he's not well equipped to deal with, because they all do. This was Eisenhower's. I think the record on balance is a reasonably progressive one, a reasonably important one, especially because I think that the Warren appointment, Brown, the 57 Civil Rights Act, and Little Rock became milestones in the story of the civil rights movement. They are to this day. The fact that most of us in this room even know what those things are is a sign of their importance, and Eisenhower was critical to making them happen. They might not have happened without him. Okay, that's how we can say he was consequential in this respect. One little piece of evidence is that in 1956, 40% of the black vote went for Eisenhower. 40% of the African American vote for Eisenhower. The highest margin of any Republican president in the modern era. Okay? The third example of Eisenhower as a consequential president, my last example, much briefer. We can come back to it if you like. And it relates to presidential leadership. Eisenhower developed what I call a disciplined presidency, much like the one we're enjoying today. Sorry, I couldn't get 10 to 15 minutes in without that. Eisenhower crafted a system for governing while in office. He built the National Security Council into the main engine of presidential decision-making in foreign affairs, and any of you all who have used the Eisenhower-era NSC papers are so thankful that he did, because they kept amazing records, and they wrote down everything they said, and they debated issues ad nauseum, and it's a wonderful source for scholars. He chaired almost all of its meetings across 8 years. I did the math. Eisenhower chaired 90% of the meetings of the National Security Council. They met once a week, and he was almost always there. And they spent 2 hours or more talking about global issues. That was part of his system. Once a week, it was the NSC. In the same week, he met with the cabinet. The same week, he met with congressional leaders. In the same week, he gave a press conference. Every week, those 4 things were absolutely set in stone. He gave a press conference once a week in person. Obviously, this is a thing of the past, but Eisenhower felt it was his job to talk to the press, and he did so for half an hour every week. That's why he's often said to have been such a syntactically challenged, because he was alleged to be hiding things from the press, but in fact he just talked to them so much. You can find all kinds of examples of being tongue-tied, but that's because he was so available to them, and he was not scripted. Like the Philadelphia 76ers, Eisenhower trusted the process. He was a process man. He always had been. That's how he succeeded in the Army, and he built a system, and then he stuck with it. And the reason that he stuck with it is because he felt that was the best way to manage crises when they came. And of course they did. So discipline is the third characteristic, and I think it's one that we could look back on and say that Eisenhower has something to teach us about how to organize government and organize leadership. So in summary, Eisenhower was a consequential and serious man, and the fact that he was once thought, and is still thought in some circles, to be a lightweight or an amateur or unimportant or a caretaker, that is a puzzling and unfortunately persistent historical fallacy. Totally wrong, and I hope I will have buried that, at least not by myself. I've had a lot of help, but I will finally bury that myth once and for all. All right, well, I want to switch gears now. So that's my argument. I told you that it wasn't just a biography. It's actually a work of history with an argument about Eisenhower's consequence for for post-war America. But I want to switch to the second part of my presentation and ask you to listen to an idea that I have about explaining, trying to understand Eisenhower's Cold War strategy, which I think will interest many of you who are interested in foreign affairs. This is something that a lot of scholars have studied, but I'm not quite sure we have it quite right yet, and I want to float something by you. Long ago, journalists coined a phrase that has stuck to Eisenhower's Cold War grand strategy. They called it the new look, right? It's one thing everybody knows. It's in all your U.S. textbooks. The new look was really very simple, according to even the contemporary journalists who coined that phrase. The best way to halt the Soviet Union and spread of communism in the Cold War was simply to get rid of all those expensive, ground troops. Slash that. That's too expensive. That'll will blow up the budget. Build a lot of nuclear weapons because they're reasonably affordable, and then basically threaten to use them whenever a crisis rolled around. Occasionally you could launch a coup d'etat here and there. But basically, not a nukes and a few little coups around the edges. That's more or less what the new look was said to be. Actually, the new look wasn't, the contemporaries didn't know about the covert operation. So basically they just said it was about massive nuclear deterrence. And it was so easy to follow this strategy that Eisenhower was able to spend most of his presidency golfing because he really just could leave the running of the Cold War to the generals. This was a very common, you wouldn't believe how critical, maybe you would believe, I was stunned to learn how critical the contemporary press was and how contemptuous much of the contemporary press was of Eisenhower as president. That's really, they started to run him down more or less even before he became president. He's the most underestimated man. It's really quite a puzzle. Well, a later generation of scholars, as many of you will know, in the 80s and the 90s, using mountains of new archival material, blew up this image of an unconnected, undisciplined, detached Eisenhower. And they showed Eisenhower was hands-on, he was smart, he was deeply engaged as a president, working very hard to manage the complexities of the Cold War. Yes, they agreed. Eisenhower's Cold War strategy was indeed reliant on a large nuclear deterrent, as well as continental defense, a strong alliance system, military aid, economic aid, all of these elements, and the bolstering of capitalism. But what was surprising about Eisenhower, they argued, was how cautious he was, how prudent he was, how restrained, that's my key word, how restrained he was with respect to using America's immense power. Historian Robert Devine, who was one of the early Eisenhower revisionists, he praised Eisenhower's Cold War strategy for its restraint. Devine claimed that Ike's greatness lay in his, quote, admirable self-restraint, and, quote, his moderation and prudence. And this idea of Eisenhower as a restrained strategist, one who always found a way to avoid war, deflect conflict, husband U.S. power, that's the centerpiece of much of Eisenhower studies. Other scholars, however, have argued that when it came to dealing with the Third World, Eisenhower was anything but restrained. Of course, Ohio State's Bob McMahon conceded that Ike was, all right, restrained in his handling of great power relations, but was unrestrained when it came to using covert operations against anti-colonial nationalists. So it's common in the literature to see Eisenhower as having a split personality. Judicious, restrained when dealing with the Soviets, reckless and brutal when dealing with the Third World as a whole. A kind of Jekyll and Hyde. I am not persuaded that this is right. I've been trying to figure out how to piece these two personalities together. I want to suggest that Eisenhower was animated by one central idea of how to use America's power in the Cold War. I call it strategic patience. Maybe that's not the right word. If it's not persuasive, maybe you'll tell me. But that's the phrase that I kept coming back to. My interpretation of Eisenhower's Cold War strategy is this. His overriding concern was how to acquire and maintain strategic power. How to acquire and maintain strategic power. How to use it, or its potential, so you can use its potential, to achieve quite specific geopolitical aims while avoiding great power war. He held to this strategic concept of amassing power and deploying it surgically in all areas of his Cold War policy. Whether he was facing off against the Chinese over Taiwan, whether the British facing off over the British over Suez, or the Russians over Berlin, or the Guatemalans and Cubans, this concept of strategic patience seems to have guided him, and I want to give you some examples and see if I can persuade you that this is what was going on, okay? I don't have PowerPoint. About 8 people asked me, what, no PowerPoint? How can you give a talk without PowerPoint? I thought, well, just going to have to try. So here are a few examples of strategic patience at work. So, Asia. Eisenhower gets loads of praise for being so restrained with respect to Asia. Why? Korean armistice, 1953, didn't send in the Marines in 1954 to Vietnam. Good. But was he really all that restrained? When Mao's China began to test American resolve to defend Taiwan by shelling the offshore islands, the nationalist-held islands of Quemoy and Matsu in late 54 and early 55, Eisenhower's response then was very firm, much firmer than it had been in Vietnam. Even though he knew the small offshore islands were militarily insignificant, he believed, and I think he was probably right, that they did form a tripwire on the way to an invasion of Taiwan. And if an invasion of Taiwan should come about by communist China, Eisenhower had decided it would lead to all-out war against China. And if war came with China over Taiwan, Eisenhower asserted in the NSC, it would go nuclear. There was no ambiguity about it. Quote, if we are to attack communist China, the president said, he was firmly opposed to holding back like we did in Korea. Eisenhower went to Congress to ask for the authorization to use military force to defend Taiwan from Chinese aggression, and Congress enthusiastically gave its assent. Eisenhower didn't want to fritter away blood and treasure in Vietnam, in the jungles of Vietnam. He said that again and again and again, and despite what Fred Logevall says, I think he really was never going to intervene in Vietnam. But in the case of the offshore islands crisis, he sang a very different tune. He felt that it was entirely acceptable to use nuclear weapons should that eventuality come, an invasion of Taiwan. And his Secretary of State said the same thing in private. John Foster Dulles to Walter Beadle Smith, he said, an atomic war on China, he said, was, quote, infinitely to be preferred to the task of intervention in Indochina, unquote. They made the connection perfectly clear. In 1955 and again in 58, the administration was fully prepared to defend Taiwan with nuclear weapons. Why the difference? Why one and not the other? Because for Eisenhower, Indochina was the wrong war, in the wrong place, with unclear strategic objectives. No point in getting involved helping the French prop up their colonial empire. Quite right. Taiwan was an entirely different kettle of fish. The use of overwhelming force in this place at this time would achieve U.S. goals, he believed, of halting a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, and Chinese aggression against Taiwan would provide sufficient moral high ground for the United States, and on top of that, Eisenhower bet the Soviets would not get involved. So he made a calculated judgment about where to place down a marker and where not to do so. We know that Mao backed down after 55 and 58, perhaps for reasons of his own. We don't entirely know what his strategy was, but it did lead to a de-escalation of the crisis, Eisenhower's firmness. So his decision-making in this crisis suggests a sensitivity to the value of strategic patience. Unlike Indochina, Eisenhower felt he'd chosen the ground well. He had the weapons at hand that he needed to achieve a particular objective. He had congressional support, which he never did in Indochina. He had already shown restraint and a willingness to compromise in Korea and in Indochina. But now he would stand his ground over Taiwan. The record is plain. Eisenhower was ready to defend a major attack that threatened Taiwan with a very powerful air attack on China, including significant use of nuclear weapons. And I think the Taiwan crisis, next to the Cuban Missile Crisis, are the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. So I want to argue that this kind of preparation for a nuclear war against an adversary, quite frankly, should not be termed restraint. Rather, Eisenhower was preparing for war. He was fully ready to unleash U.S. strategic power to attain specific objectives with overwhelming force. The difference between restraint and patience, you may think, is a semantic one, but I hope I'm making it clear that I don't think so. I'm arguing Eisenhower's policy was not passive. That's the term. Restraint gives you the sense of someone just hoping the thing will go away. And what I'm getting at with strategic patience is something more active. It was not passive, and it was not opposed to the use of overwhelming force if necessary. Eisenhower deployed American power and its potential to close off options for his adversary. If they wanted Taiwan, they had to understand how enormous the consequences would be. And I think that was a nimble strategic move that proved very effective. It wouldn't have proved effective without the mobilization of enormous power, both political and military. Okay. That's example one. A second example is Suez, and this is a pretty clear one, but what's interesting about the Suez case is that the adversary in this case is not the communist bloc, but it's the closest ally of the United States, Britain. And indeed, we have a twin crisis here in October and November of 1956 in both Suez and Hungary. And he's facing a rebellion by his closest allies in Egypt in late October, as well as a Soviet intervention in Hungary. I think this is the best 10 days of Eisenhower's presidency, the handling of Suez and Hungary, while, by the way, he gets reelected to the presidency along the way. Not a bad 10 days. In one of these two spheres, the Hungary crisis, Eisenhower knows right away he's not going to get involved to stop the Soviet invasion of Hungary. He just automatically sees this as verboten. This is part of the Soviet sphere of influence. But you may say, well, obviously, but he got a ton of criticism for it. He got a ton of political criticism for it from everybody, including some of his closest political allies. I'll just give you one quote. You know, Claire Booth Luce, one of the great ardent Republican hawks of the era, she writes a telegram to him in big capital letters saying, President Eisenhower, ask not for whom the bell tolls in Hungary today. It tolls for us. If freedom's holy light is extinguished in blood and iron there. That's Claire Booth Luce. She, theatrical person. Eisenhower totally unmoved. In fact, he directed Ambassador Chip Bolin. He said, Bolin, go in there and tell them we have zero intention of ever peeling Hungary off from the Warsaw Pact. We're hands off. We're not trying to pick a fight with you. He directly delivered that message to Bulganin and Khrushchev. So that was easy for him to resolve. Part of the reason that he didn't have an interest in picking a fight over Hungary was, of course, because the Suez crisis was burning at the same moment, which had begun with the nationalization of the Suez Canal on July 26, 1956 by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Nationalization of the canal. What did Eisenhower think about that? In fact, he took a very philosophical view about the matter, quite different from Anthony Eden. He told his advisors that he understood Nasser's desire for independence, quote, and this is Eisenhower, for slapping the white man down. He said, I see what he wants to do. I get it. To use force against Nasser, he said, we're not going to get hysterical about it, one of his favorite words. We can unpack that later. He said, we're not going to go to war over it, quote unquote, and this is in the NSC. He said to force Nasser, to use force against Nasser would, quote, array the world from Dakar to the Philippines against us. That's the whole Muslim world. Besides, Nasser's action, he said, were not, strictly speaking, illegal. And he immediately wrote to Anthony Eden, the British Prime Minister, and he said, expressing his firm opposition, quote, to even contemplating the use of military force, Anthony. That's you, Anthony, I'm talking to. Don't even contemplate it. To no avail, of course, Eden is meanwhile backtracking with the French and the Israelis, plotting their invasion. Determined to avoid another Munich, he launches the Suez invasion with the British, the French, and the Israelis on October 29. Eisenhower believed that what was really at stake here? What he believed was really at stake was the Soviet reaction. If the Soviets sent military aid to Egypt, as they had already done in Syria, or if Soviet planes got tangled up with the flights coming out of Cyprus, where a lot of the French and British aircraft were, we would be in war, he said. We'd be in war. So he absolutely needed to stop the invasion somehow. In this case, Eisenhower again did not act with restraint. I think that's the wrong term. At least, certainly the British didn't think he was acting with restraint. His actions were decisive, they were immediate, and they were effective. Went on national television, he admonished America's allies for their, quote, error. He went to the UN, or he sent Dulles to the UN to condemn the invasion. He announced a military cutoff of aid to Israel. He sent a series of absolutely smoldering telegrams to Anthony Eden, making his displeasure obvious. And of course, most famous, he turned the screws of global finance. The oil imports that Britain and Europe relied upon had been interrupted by the Suez crisis. The British sought out some American dollars, which then they could use to purchase oil on the open markets. And Eisenhower said, gosh, sorry, no, we're closed for business right now, leaving the British to stew and unable to purchase the vital oil that they needed to keep going. This was a perfect pressure point that Eisenhower was able to use, and he knew exactly what he was doing. He also conveyed the bitter facts of life to Anthony Eden. Britain must withdraw from Suez before it would have any support from the United States for its finances. For 3 weeks, as Eden's health was failing, as he was having a nervous breakdown, as his bile duct was coming apart again, Eisenhower just sat there saying, well, hope it all going well, Anthony. Just make sure to get out of Suez. And then, oh, and look at all this oil over here. It's just sitting here. No one's using it. And all these dollars you could have. Eden's health collapsed. He flees to Jamaica. He comes back a ruined man, has to resign the prime ministership, leaving the mess in Harold Macmillan's hands. But I just want to point out the absolute ruthlessness of Eisenhower's actions toward Eden. I mean, he crushed Eden. He ruined Eden. He actually ruined Anthony Eden. He almost killed him. Eisenhower's actions and he got what he wanted, by the way, of course, because Macmillan comes back in and says, right, we're getting out. And immediately Eisenhower says, oh, good for you, Harold. By the way, look at all this oil and look at all these dollars. Immediate reconciliation. No hard feelings. His actions in both of these crises, Hungary and Suez, I think, vindicate the policy of strategic patience. He rightly concluded Hungary and Egypt were the wrong places to fight the Soviets or their proxies, and Hungary was in the Soviet sphere. Egypt to invade Egypt openly, especially the way that, or secretly, the way that the Allies had done, was a terrible move from the point of view of Allied interests. So Eisenhower managed this 10-day crisis without resort to war, even at the cost of bitter recrimination from his allies. I think he imposed discipline on the alliance. He imposed discipline on his allies. There's that word again. He compelled these reckless allies to retreat from an ill-conceived invasion. He restored American prestige at the UN. He even gave some hope to those in the Third World that maybe the United States was not as irrational as the Soviets had always said they were. Here was Dwight Eisenhower making his own allies withdraw from an invasion of Egypt. What a remarkable thing. You know, Eisenhower worked really hard to try to curry favor with Nasser. They met in 1960, years later, at the UN, and it was like a reunion of old soldiers. They loved each other. You could just, embracing and so forth. Of course, it was never going to happen. But Eisenhower was naive enough to believe somehow we could get along, it's going to be great. And the British were constantly saying, this guy is terrible. Nonetheless, at that moment in 1956, Eisenhower acted with, I think, extraordinary patience, but strategically used American power to compel British to behave in the way that he wanted. Finally, and I'll just race over the Berlin crisis because it's the least interesting of my crises, though I think also one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War. But you'll remember that in November 1958, Nikita Khrushchev comes along and says, we want Berlin. We want you to sign a peace treaty with East Germany, and we want you to get out of Berlin. And Eisenhower's view of this was absolutely inflexible, totally firm. Chillingly, without any sense of hesitation, he said, no, absolutely not. He said, but we're not going to respond to the Soviets in an antagonistic fashion. The ultimatum is, of course, never going to be taken seriously by Eisenhower. But, he says, what is it the Soviets really want? What can we give them that wouldn't cost us anything? And the promise of negotiations over Berlin is really what Eisenhower feels he can give. And eventually, he offers to Khrushchev the opportunity to have a summit meeting with him, Eisenhower. They will meet at Camp David. They'll talk about Berlin. Foreign ministers will meet and talk about Berlin. Nothing will happen. But Eisenhower, initially, his views were very chilling. And I'll just tell you what he said in the National Security Council. He said, if the Russians want war over Berlin, they can have it. He said, we're not going to do anything but stand firm. He said, in order to avoid beginning with the white chips and working our way up to the blue, lifelong poker player, we should put the Russians on notice that our whole stack is in play, i.e., no escalation. We're not going to mess with that. If one finger goes wrong in Berlin, it's all-out nuclear war, and we're going to tell them that. And then we'll say we're also happy to talk about Berlin. He said America would respond in a friendly tone. He said, the question is whether we have the nerve to push our chips into the pot. He had no hesitation. He said appeasement is disaster, but if we're firm, the Soviets will back down. And they did. I think he read Khrushchev perfectly. Again, we may not think this is a big deal because we know how it worked out. Who knew that the Berlin crisis was going to resolve itself the way that it did with the building of the wall, or for that matter, the ending of the Cold War? But Eisenhower didn't know. But he was willing to threaten to go all out, to push his whole stack in play, as he said, over Berlin. Was this a restrained man? Had Eisenhower been restrained over Berlin? Not exactly. He'd been inflexible, in fact. He'd refused to budge. He relied upon the strategic deterrent to box in his adversary and dared him to make the first move, which he did not. Strategic patience worked. Okay, so what I'm saying here is that Eisenhower's approach to power and to politics, his instincts in times of crisis, I think, were informed by an uncanny sense of timing and an ability to find the pressure point of his adversary and push exactly on that pressure point. Well, the most obvious way to falsify this argument about patience, and this is what Bob McMahon would say if he were here, is to point to Eisenhower's woeful record of using secret covert operations around the world to overthrow leftist governments or to prop up right-wing governments. As Bob wrote many years ago, there seems little evidence of restraint or patience there. Guatemala, Iran, South Vietnam, Indonesia, Congo, Cuba, all of these cases, Eisenhower seemed willing to unleash all manner of outrageous actions, covert operations against these countries. They seem reckless, they seem ill-conceived, they seem terribly ideological, and to us they seem very unwise. Much of that judgment, I think, is fair, but it is also a retrospective judgment. In the book, I do condemn Eisenhower's use of the CIA and its battery of dirty tricks, and I write about it at length in the book. But I want to make the case to you that at the time, Eisenhower did not see such actions as inconsistent with his strategy for waging the Cold War. In fact, I'm going to shock you as I close. I hope I'll shock you, because I don't have PowerPoint to keep you so engaged. But I think he viewed covert operations as an inexpensive and low-risk way to notch important wins in the Cold War struggle without the risk of a wider war. Guatemala and Iran, Indonesia and Congo, even Cuba, these were places where U.S. covert operations cost paltry sums, just pennies. They did not endanger the lives of any Americans, and they did not risk setting off major conflict with the Russians. We may see such actions as morally reprehensible or strategically unwise because we know how it all worked out over the subsequent decades. But for Eisenhower, such operations, the overthrowing of governments and the attempted assassination of a number of leaders, etc., such operations were little more than the normal mowing of the lawn that a prolonged twilight struggle against a global enemy required. Far from being reckless or bloodthirsty, these were surgical strikes that expended very little U.S. power, that did not endanger the Cold War order. And, as far as Eisenhower was concerned, they served U.S. security goals. Covert operations then were actually quite consistent with the doctrine of strategic patience. They're not the Jekyll and Hyde story. They're all of a piece. Now look, I don't want to make Eisenhower's covert operations policies, I'm not here to tell you that they are virtuous or just or perfect. I'm here as a historian to try to explain why they were chosen and why they appeared so attractive at the time. Yes, it's partly because of ideological blinders and the inability to understand the problem of nationalism. But it's also because these were seen as relatively small, cheap operations with a big upside for the United States. Could the Eisenhower people have been wrong about that? Of course they could have. In a way, that's not my problem. My interest is, why did they settle on these choices? Why did they make these choices? So I just want to close by saying it's very easy, and there's so much literature by scholars and also by analysts, especially the covert operations side, to condemn Eisenhower and Dulles for their ruthlessness in the Third World, and for that matter, in waging the Cold War. And I've read that literature. I think some of it is tendentious, but much of it is fair. But here's what I want to do in ending. I just want to emphasize again, for those of you who are just setting out in your careers, the role of the historian is not to say, do I like this person or do I like these policies 50 years after the fact? You must figure out why they happened and how you interpret their origins if you're doing this kind of work. And I just want to stress that in every case that I've mentioned, and many others, Eisenhower could have done something else. He could have done something else. I'll just very quickly point that out. Eisenhower could have increased the pace of operations in Korea in 1953. They were talking about it. They were actively talking about increasing operations in Korea and indeed using atomic weapons there before Stalin died and the whole thing started to come unraveled. He could have sent a few army divisions to Dien Bien Phu in 1954. Anybody who studied this knows how much pressure Eisenhower was under. Pretty much, his cabinet was at best divided evenly, at best. And some of the most important foreign policy advisors favored helping the French, Nixon, Radford, and others. He could have struck at the Chinese artillery positions that were shelling Quemoy and Matsu in 1958 and 1955. He could have egged on the Hungarians and sent them arms. Many people wanted him to do that. He could have backed the Anglo-French-Israeli invasion of Suez and helped to topple Nasser. He could have sent a column down the Autobahn to challenge the Soviets and the East Germans in Berlin. He could have launched an all-out invasion of Cuba. All of these were things that his advisors suggested he think about and that plans were drawn up to accomplish. He did none of those things. Instead, he calculated the odds in such a way that he achieved what he thought was a good outcome for U.S. interests with the minimum use of force, keeping the Cold War cold, while containing America's principal rivals and doing it in a way that, as far as he was concerned, sustained and protected American institutions and the American economy. Eisenhower believed he had found a means to wage the Cold War in a manner best calculated to strengthen America's hand, avoid great power war, and preserve U.S. institutions. He put it this way in his memoir, which, of course, note to graduate students, don't ever rely on presidential memoirs, but this is what he said about himself, so we're ending with a very complimentary sentence about himself. He thought America had threaded its way with watchfulness and determination through narrow and dangerous waters between appeasement and global war. Threaded its way between appeasement and global war. To a great degree, I think Eisenhower did manage to accomplish that balancing act, and quite honestly, I'm not sure his successors did as well. Well, thank you. I would love to have your questions and thoughts. Yes, please.
So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how anti-statism fits into your argument, particularly probably his building of the warfare state.
Yes, well, so Eisenhower ran for president as a conservative. And boy, he was like a man unleashed who had finally shed his military uniform, and he was a politician all of a sudden. And to his own surprise, I think, he turned out to be a conservative Republican. And he said, the New Deal is terrible. Look at how giant it is. It's leading to the smothering of individual initiative. It is the dictatorship of the state. That's where we're headed, they said. It's a kind of socialism, et cetera. You get the idea. He was very vigorous, and he did this while he was Columbia president for 2 or 3 years. He spoke in this manner, and then indeed on the trail. Much of that he dropped almost immediately when he became president. Shocker. Someone who ran for president didn't live up to the rhetoric of the campaign trail. I think his view was simply that the military-industrial complex that he built, which he acknowledged building in his famous speech, was actually the only way to protect precisely the freedoms that he believed so strongly in. Now, is that a convenient, kind of paradoxical situation? Yes, it is. Did Eisenhower believe it to be true? Absolutely. He believed the military-industrial, he said, we regret, we're sorry, we have built the military-industrial complex. He said, we have been compelled, those were his words, we have been compelled to build the military-industrial complex in order to protect our freedoms and our liberties. Now, the great challenge, having done that, is to make sure that the military-industrial complex does not overwhelm our institutions. And by the way, see you later. And if you really think that John Kennedy is going to do this well, he was very bitter about Kennedy's victory. My own view is the military-industrial complex has quite a lot to, the speech has quite a lot to do with the chastising of Kennedy, and indeed chastising of the country for electing Kennedy, whom he felt was too young and inexperienced to control the complex. So, long-winded answer to say, I think he felt the two were actually, one needed the other. Yes?
I'm just struck by the contrast between this story and the kinds of stories that are told of Kennedy and Nixon and so on, you know, Eisenhower comes out as a man for whom the political psychologists would have nothing to say. He's like the spirit of the age, a sort of pure rational actor, which is interesting. But also thinking about patience as sort of your term for what's going on. In terms of the longer trajectory, that may make sense. But there's a sort of vernacular, you know, name for what he's doing in each of these three instances, which is simply picking your battles. Quite literally.
Right.
And I don't know the lineage of that term, but I've never heard anybody quite exemplify it. to that
Well,
degree.
I'm sure the Bergeron Center is probably filled with a lot of smart people who know the origins of that term. I don't either, but this picking your battles is exactly what he's doing, and it's no accident that he'd spent his whole career doing just that, or at least reading the works of predecessors who had done just that. In many ways, what I've described, those of you who are military historians will recognize it is kind of the American way of war. If you're going to go to battle, you go in and you go in to win. There's no such thing as a small war or, you know, a small strike. It's prepare for the biggest possible conflict, because as Clausewitz taught that generation of officers, and he did read his Clausewitz. People will poo-poo that, oh, it surely didn't influence his presidency. But I think it influenced the way the United States conducted the Second World War, which is you don't know what's going to happen once war begins. War has a way of dramatically changing once it starts. So prepare for the worst. And that generally means prepare not just to defeat the enemy over this one little piece of territory, but prepare to completely crush the life out of your enemy and occupy his country. Eisenhower has this notion of war always accelerating, always expanding into the back of his mind. So any of these crises is why he's already at the end game before it begins. That's why I cannot possibly conceive of him intervening in northern Vietnam in 1954. It just doesn't match the Eisenhower that I see again and again and again in these documents. Pick your battles is exactly right. I'm going to come, yes, please. Yeah.
You mentioned some things he did not do, and there's some other things he did not do. He didn't listen to George Kennan and others and go slower on German rearmament. And he didn't listen to Kennan's ideas that maybe the Cold War was not so much a military, but ideological and economic struggle, and militarizing NATO the way he was doing would lead to a militarized Cold War that was avoidable. He didn't build on the Austrian State Treaty and try to disarm what was now an escalating central front in Europe. He didn't recognize nationalism in the Third World when it had a democratic face in Iran, but did when it had a fascistic face in Egypt. And so I come away, and you mentioned that he protected these American institutions, but he built a CIA that operated beneath the radar in violation of all that we think about in terms of what the core American transparent democracy is about, while he allowed un-American activities committees to run rampant in the U.S. Congress and Senate. So I'm not so sure I come away with, I don't want to sound like I'm totally with Bob McKeon, but it doesn't strike me that you're following through in terms of really explaining the degree to which he saw these things as military contests and the degree to which the institution he was protecting in the United States was the military.
Yeah, I mean, all I can say is, of course, everything you've just described is in my book, and I agree with you. The problem is to try to figure out, is he the Jekyll and Hyde? Is he the man who appears to be restrained in some cases and is ruthless and brutal in others? Or is he just a bad man? And he could do no right, because there's always going to be a case in which he's screwed up. So different from all the other presidents, right? No, of course, Eisenhower has his flaws, many flaws, and I think the inability to understand, as I put it in the book, a failure of moral imagination with respect to the nationalism and the Third World. You're quite right. He was a cold warrior without a great deal of imagination about what the world might look like had he been a different person. Had he not been president in the 1950s, had he not been Dwight Eisenhower, it could have been different. But I'm sorry, I can't write history that way. I have to figure out, why did he do the things that he did? Then I can say, I think he made a bad judgment, but not until I've decided I understand what motivated his thinking. And what everyone has told me is, well, he's just a complicated guy, he's full of contradictions. And that's fine, I can live with that. I just don't find that satisfying. So I'm trying to figure out if the way he saw his policies, there was a kind of consistency to it.
But why call it patience? Because it would have seemed to me that Adlai Stevenson
Oh, boy.
And Kennan and people like that could imagine a political future in Europe that relied on patience and some risk-taking
Uh-huh.
to see
Well,
if you
can I
could
ask-
build on Austria and maybe German...
German reunification? Seriously? In the 50s? I
Not
don't see.
German entry into NATO. Right.
Which we like. We want that. That's a good thing.
54, 55, right?
Yeah,
Government
with
of
1955.
Germany, entry into NATO as a military ally.
We like
These
that.
were
That's good.
controversial questions, right? So whether this was the
I've
right
written a
thing
whole
to
book
do.
about it, in fact. Yes, it is a controversial question. Not this one.
And there were voices in the country who had an alternative view to this.
But not George Kennan. Which Kennan? I mean, right? I can play that. But which Kennan? Kennan came to the White House in the Solarium Project in 1953 and basically said, I've just laid out the alternative A for basically continuing containment exactly as Truman had been doing it. And Eisenhower walked away saying, well, that's probably about what we'll do. And Kennan walked away saying, Eisenhower is the smartest man in the room. I have huge respect for him now. They actually saw eye to eye in 1953. So we can say, Kennan is one of those figures that since he's so changeable, we can always find him saying something about the Cold War that's different from what he said last week. But with respect to handling containment, even as late as the Solarium Project, this is not just the long telegram. Kennan basically approves of a robust policy of alliances, economic development, maybe not the militarization that you're describing, but it suits Eisenhower just fine. I think that's exactly Eisenhower's policy. So, to me, Eisenhower on Europe is a model of strategic, not just patience, but strategic patience, where it becomes harder, and I think it's actually easy. You should go after the Asia stuff, because can his policies be seen as judicious and strategically restrained there? The whole Logowall book basically contradicts what I'm saying. That in fact, he desperately wanted to get involved in Asia, and he was stopped by the courageous British and the heroic Congress. Okay, I disagree, but that's where it seems to me the weak link is, not on Europe. Yes?
So thanks for a really interesting talk. I wanted to push back or ask you to say a little bit more about, you gave Eisenhower a lot of credit at the beginning of your talk for kind of creating and legitimizing American sort of globalized Cold War strategy. But as I sort of, and I'm not a historian, but as I sort of know the events of that time, I would have, in terms of building the national security state, I would have started with something like NSC 68 and said, the Truman administration already built this thing, or laid out the blueprint for this, well beforehand. And so I might have said Truman built it. And then if you want to talk about legitimating it, by the time Eisenhower's in office, there are already large majorities of the American public who favor an active role in world politics, even majorities who favor peacetime conscription. So I guess I'm not sure why you're giving Eisenhower so much credit for that. Is this, and the one thing I could think of that maybe you could talk more about is this have to do with his role within the Republican Party and making this a bipartisan consensus, or say more about what his role is?
Yeah, no, I think it's pretty clear that, if you look at NSC 68 lays out a very aggressive plan, but it's only a plan, and it is not a document that reflects strategic patience. It is a rollback document. It is an extraordinarily aggressive hawkish policy, and it's only a plan. And it's just on the cusp of the Korean War. So, of course, Korea then breaks out, and there's a period of dramatic rearmament, of mobilization of resources, a commitment to wage war in Korea that has a huge effect on the military-industrial complex. So we certainly, of course, and my colleague Mel Leffler constantly tells me, no, Harry Truman is really responsible for the military-industrial complex, and he wrote a big book about that too. But my view is what makes the Eisenhower period different is that the Korean War is over. And yet there is not the pendulum swinging back to demobilization. There's not the process of saying, well, it's back to the farm, everybody. We don't need to maintain this, the infrastructure we built for the Korean War. Because after all, that's what's happening after World War II is demobilization. And in fact, Eisenhower was chief of staff, and he hated having to dismantle the gigantic machine that won the Second World War. So the norm after World War I, after World War II, is to withdraw, is to demobilize. And after Korea, that doesn't happen. Of course, there's a shifting of resources, of priorities, but the military spending continues at an extraordinarily high rate for 8 peacetime years. Now, that needs an explanation, and it's not just NSC 68. It's the legitimization of the Cold War consensus. that the Cold War is a good thing provided we keep it cold. We can fight the Cold War, keep the communists away, protect American institutions, be a robust economic multilateral nation, continue to be democratic, but we have to pay a price, and that price is vigilance, a word Eisenhower loved. He said, we live in an age of peril. He said it again and again and again. As a Cold War leader in a peacetime decade, he was remarkably firm about the idea that the nation needed to continue to remain mobilized. That's what I think is interesting. And I think that's very different from Harry Truman, who was drawn into the Korean War as a surprise. He reacted as any president, I think, would have done. There's a dramatic and unplanned and actually poorly executed expansion of the military and the economy. It has terrific negative ripple effects on the American economy. Inflation and prices soar. Eisenhower sees all this and says, I don't want that. I want to figure out how to make it normal, how to make preparation for conflict normal. I think that's the story of the 50s to me. Mitch.
I want to follow up on
Yeah.
what Chris said, and I think I agree with him on the foreign policy front, but I'd make the same argument on the domestic front as well. You're calling this the age of Eisenhower. When I think of the legislation passed in like the mid-1950s, Social Security expansion and wage expansion, 150,000 new public housing units, Civil Rights Act, Eisenhower was, to some extent, a passive player in this. Senate Majority Leader Lyndon Johnson, a wave of liberals that have come in. In some cases, these are passed despite Eisenhower. And I would also argue that these are the results of long-term processes that have been put into motion.
Yeah.
Let's talk civil rights, right? Truman desegregates the Army. You have a whole new sort of, well, he puts
starts
an
it.
order in place that impacts the attitude of African Americans towards the federal government. And we have a much more militant civil rights movement that's starting to emerge at this time, based in their experiences in World War II and Korea, and then the Emmett Till case and others.
Yeah.
So these are forces, I would argue these domestic changes are being driven, A, by changes from below, and B, by the opposition party. So how is this the age of Eisenhower?
No, that's again, you know that that's something of a caricature of how the policy process works. The opposition party doesn't just simply, write the legislation and get it passed. If it happens in the presidential administration, unless it's actually vetoed, well, we can see, and we talked about this last night, there's a high degree of collaboration and cooperation. I'll just mention a couple of other things. Eisenhower spears the Social Security expansion. You can say, well, poo-poo that, but that's contrary to much of his own party's interests. That 10 million new people are put on Social Security. They're mostly self-employed because he loves Social Security. The balanced budget is actually a very distinctive policy achievement that Eisenhower spends a great deal of time on. You could say, well, that's not transformative. It isn't, but it's a sign of the way he governs, and I think it actually takes a great deal of his effort and time. The Highway Act is an extraordinary example of Eisenhower's initiative. He took the initiative. He shaped that bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was a very weak piece of legislation because of Lyndon Johnson. The reason it was so toothless and that Eisenhower almost voted it is because, you know this, maybe the room doesn't know this, Lyndon Johnson gutted the Civil Rights Act of 1957. He cynically said the only way you're going to get this passed is if I bring the South, or at least I neutralize the South. He managed to neutralize the South by making sure there was absolutely no teeth in the 1957 Civil Rights Act. So we get the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department out of it. That's about it. Minor increase of the ability of the federal government to intervene in civil rights violations and voting rights violations. So it's weak compared to what would come in 64 and 65. But Eisenhower fights a really significant battle, a field in which he's not particularly prepared to fight. And Herbert Brownell, as Attorney General, is a very important player in making it happen and also making it palatable at the end of the day for Eisenhower to actually sign the bill, which he thought about vetoing for a while. He also passes a huge tax act, Internal Revenue Act, 1954, is basically the tax act in which all of us grew up. And, he starts to cut marginal tax rates, but he actually thinks paying of taxes is okay. But that's where all the loopholes start being put into the tax code, is through Eisenhower. And then I will just mention three more things, because you brought it up. What about the response to Sputnik? The response to Sputnik is very interesting. Eisenhower is criticized widely in the public, especially by the Democrats. In fact, Johnson himself, who holds a lot of embarrassing hearings, to say, look, you see, these pathetic Republicans, how weak they are on defense. They can't even keep up with the Russians. And he stages a great, as only Johnson could do, he stages a great deal of embarrassing hearings to try to embarrass the administration. In fact, he even gets administration officials to come and say, yes, we've fallen behind the Russians. Eisenhower doesn't panic. He doesn't say, gosh, give me $100 more billion to spend on missiles, because he already knows how many missiles are being built. He knows that we could have put a satellite into space before the Russians. He could care less about the satellite. It's the ICBM that matters. It's the targeting, the targeting of the missiles that matters. So he says, instead of giving me that, I'm going to ask to solve the crisis in a different way. And he passes legislation. And the legislation is the Defense Reorganization Act of 1958, which finally does something Eisenhower had wanted to do since he was chief of staff, namely give the defense secretary much more power over the chiefs, the service chiefs, in the budgeting and organization process of the Pentagon. Fascinating stuff, but really turns out to be crucially important. He gets a piece of legislation passed because of the crisis, because of his response to the crisis. The National Defense Education Act, which for all I know may have actually pumped money into the Mershon Center over the many years. I know quite a few people who've taken money out of that. Invested money in science and technology to fight the Cold War from 1958. And finally, the creation of NASA in 1958. So Eisenhower used the Sputnik crisis to get stuff done through Congress that he might not have gotten done without it. So I take your point. No, this just to actually now come back and agree with you, there's no such thing as an age of anybody. I know that. It is a heuristic device by a writer to try to capture a theme. And I think I've done that using Eisenhower because I think that when we look at that 20-year, 18-year period, he seems to typify the age. I also think in many of these cases he was consequential with respect to domestic and policy legislation. But of course there are examples in which he was not the principal driver. And that's probably true of most presidents. Okay, sorry, long-winded answer. But yes, sir, you've been waiting patiently.
Your talk suggested to me an entirely different president with the same policies, speak softly and carry a big stick. Mm-hmm. Later on in the military, we called it, the policy then was speak sticky and carry a big soft.
Right, the big soft. I like that, the big soft. Yeah, TR, I guess, I mean, there are cases in which Eisenhower spoke very loudly and carried a big stick. There are cases in which he spoke softly and carried a small stick. I think what's difficult, I mean, I'm just confessing to you, I think Eisenhower can be a difficult guy to nail down. And what I'm trying to do is figure out, is there a coherent strategy that links his actions together? You know, on civil rights, at times he seems to me to be speaking loudly and carrying no stick at all. There are plenty of cases in which he's not as aggressive in following through on what he says he wants. So I don't know if TR is exactly the right one. I'll tell you one that you'll be surprised by, and that is, and a few people have mentioned this to me without me trying to make this connection, and that's President Obama. And I'm not prepared, I haven't thought it through, but quite a few people say, that sounds a little like Obama. And so maybe that's the second essay I should be writing, is the Obama-Hauer era. Yes?
Regarding your theory and your terminology, I think that your theory is quite interesting. I was just wondering if strategic pragmatism might be better than strategic patience, because you're really outlining a very pragmatic approach, not only to domestic politics, but to foreign policy. And I think that that would really capture not only the decisive nature in which he engages with his allies, but the nature in which he engages with China and with the Soviet Union.
Yeah. I like that. I think let me think about that. Pragmatism versus patience. I wanted to keep the idea in that he was a man who had an exquisite sense of timing. And patience gave me that word. But I agree that it's it's not quite right. It's too soft. It sounds too much like restraint, and I have to demonstrate the difference, I think, a little more sharply. But that's helpful. Yes, David?
Yes,
Hi.
Just a quick question.
Yeah.
You didn't mention this in the talk, but you in the book. What do you think most explains the gradual rise over the past half century in President Eisenhower's reputation as president? Because he's gone from lower middle obscurity, at least
Yeah.
to near greatness.
I know. Yay. Well, the latest C-SPAN poll is interesting, and that was the 2017 one that gave him that had him at the highest number ever. He was number 5 after Washington, Lincoln, and both Roosevelts. And perhaps you participated in that poll. I didn't, but I asked a few people who participated in it, and they said, "Good God!" And these were people who had actually voted. You know, so I didn't talk about this because I loved the fact that just as I was coming out with an Eisenhower book, he hit number 5. But The CNN poll offered 10 categories of analysis, and everybody, the historians who were polled, were asked to rank the presidents in those 10 categories. And they included international affairs, stewardship of the economy, moral integrity, relations with Congress, various domestic policies, a couple of other things that I can't recall at the moment. And on average, Eisenhower came out at the top in all of those categories. What's happened is we have figures like a John Kennedy who started to slip in the moral dimension. We have figures like Andrew Jackson who started significantly to slip because of his views on race. Figures like Woodrow Wilson, who are normally in the top 10, who started to slip because of his views on race. So our contemporary assessments are changing, and the result is that's actually opened the way for a man like Eisenhower, who's consistently given pretty high ratings all across the board, and that's how he came up top there. But in general, I would say, when I've talked to audiences, and I'm talking to quite a few of them at the moment, this sounds like I'm pandering, but the fact is the audiences that I speak to seem very, very tired of partisanship. And I'm not sure they are tired of partisanship, so maybe it's a little bit of false consciousness, but they say they are. And I think when they look back and they say what kinds of leaders one might admire who didn't seem to be principally a party leader, they often turn to Eisenhower. That's ironic because, as I mentioned earlier, Eisenhower ran as a strong conservative, and he liked thinking of himself as the leader of the Republican Party. He tried to, as you know, moderate it in some ways, not terribly successfully, but he believed the party, he believed himself as a party leader. But above all, when in times of crisis, and I think he preferred to think of himself as a truly national leader, a national figure, and not having had a lifetime in partisan politics allowed him to think of himself as a man above party. So I think that's part of it. I also, just very quickly, just to say that I think that he was done brown by a lot of partisan hacks, especially, I hate to say this because so many people love the Kennedys, but the Kennedys just killed Eisenhower. They really did a number on him, and so did Arthur Schlesinger, and so did all of the Kennedy biographers. The charm and the contrast between the two is so great. It was so easy for Eisenhower to be made to look like just a lump of wood next to the sparkling Kennedy. And he never really got over that contrast. And it's really very difficult to unmoor people from that notion that, thank heavens for the Kennedys, because gosh, we finally got away from that awful, boring old years of Eisenhower. And I found, looking at the coverage of the 50s, although the press was very critical of Ike, his personality was considered to be very large and dynamic. So anyway, that's part of my thinking. Yes, sir.
So I think you make important points about timing. NSC 68, I agree with you, it would not have been nearly as significant if the Korean War hadn't come a few months later. I think that's partly a statement about the importance of the Korean War, though, not just the unimportance of NSC 68. I particularly like your treatment of the October 1965 and the two simultaneous incidents. And I got to think a lot more about the different Asian things, and I don't have any question to ask you on that. Could you mention 3 books that involve Eisenhower era in some way, other than your biography?
There are none.
And other than anybody else's biography, and other than obviously Logoval's Embers of War, which you don't.
Oh no, I love the book. Just on this one issue, we disagree.
Okay. So,
I actually really do love the book. It's just on that one thing about it.
All right. So can you mention 3 that you would suggest?
On Eisenhower?
I want to read? Yeah, or in the Eisenhower period. It doesn't have to be, probably shouldn't be a biography since you have a higher opinion.
Well, I mean, I don't want to deflect the question, but I have a lengthy essay about all the books that have been ever been written in my book. So I acknowledge the scholarship, which is extensive, and I try to organize it so that you can see by topic what are the best books and what one might consult. So there's like a 12-page essay in the back of the book about the literature. No, I was pleased the publisher allowed me to do that. There are a number of books. You mentioned Suez. There's a lot of it Suez. I don't know if you know David Nichols. He's a very diligent scholar who has done a lot of patient work unearthing a couple of key crises, and I think he does a very good on 1956. I think that's a good book. Very patient, very careful, very well researched book. There's Alex von Tunzelmann has a big new book on Suez that's pretty good. And there's a great deal of literature by the British about Suez because it's such an important point turning point there. Keith Kyle probably wrote the best book, I think, on Suez. Keith Kyle. So, but I won't go into it. There's a long. I do have a long list. Maybe we can talk a little bit after. Yeah. Yes, in the back.
Yeah, looking from outside in rather than inside out, how did the Europeans like Eisenhower, if you leave the UK out of this, how did the continental European leaders like Eisenhower, and specifically did Eisenhower have a good relationship with Charles de Gaulle?
Yes, he had a pretty good relationship with de Gaulle. You remember that de Gaulle comes back to power in 1958 under murky circumstances that have to do with the Algerian War, in which Eisenhower actually and the U.S. administration plays an important role, which I regret I didn't deal with much in the book. But Eisenhower plays an important role in basically showing that the United States doesn't want the Algerian War to keep going, and that opens the path for de Gaulle to come back to power, because it's through the problem of getting out of Algeria that de Gaulle is basically called back. And there's a bit of tension over Algeria because initially, remember, de Gaulle is he wants to keep the war going, thinks, hey, we're not going to give this thing up. And then he begins to change his mind. And it's not American pressure that does it. It's his own sense of strategic pick your battles. He sees the writing on the wall that Algeria is not going to remain French, so he changes his mind. But the two of them have a very, obviously the most common thing they share is a military background. They also share a sense that they are, in a sense, above party, above politics. Of course, both of them were the most political animals in the world, but they actually could style themselves as men above party. Eisenhower and de Gaulle met a number of times, and they always had a very formal relationship, but a decent one, a strong one, based on mutual respect. The classic example is the way in which de Gaulle backed the United States during the U-2 crisis. The U-2 airplane was shot down in 1960, and the famous summit that was planned was ruined. And Khrushchev, yelled and fulminated at de Gaulle before he got before Eisenhower came into the picture in Paris. And de Gaulle said, "Look, I'm not taking it. Don't come in here with your bluster. We're going to, I'm not going to use my authority to try to compel the United States president to apologize or to grovel before you." He was very firm in his relationship backing the U.S. So, again, de Gaulle's another man that gets a bad press. I think he, more often than not, was a pretty good ally. That's leaving aside 1966 and the withdrawal from NATO, which is a very sad occasion. West Germans loved Eisenhower. My goodness, he was the picture of let's say Social Democrats, maybe not so much, but the party power, the Christian Democrats were basically pretty strongly in favor of Eisenhower because he was such a stalwart with respect to NATO, with respect to American presence in Western Europe, and especially Western Germany, and because they knew that he had their back. So he was popular in Europe. Of course, he was also the very first NATO Supreme Commander. And as such, he knew every European head of state. He knew every defense minister in Europe. He had spent much of his career in the 40s and 50s in Europe before becoming president. And he was the biggest champion of Allied cooperation that I think probably any president has ever been. Because of his war experience with the British, but also because of NATO, he felt a bond with the Western Europeans. So my view is he was very much admired. That doesn't mean there weren't occasional protests, but that's the presidency. Presidents are always protested against when they travel abroad. Yes?
My question is about golf. Was his golfing a performance to help calm the American people, or was it just occasional?
So, cool. Dang, I should have had the chapter on the performing relaxation. But no, I think that's an interesting question, actually. And I think the answer is no, it was not a performance. One little biographical tidbit that you may not know is that Eisenhower was a phenomenal athlete. And as a young man in the Army, he was one of the best football players. He almost went pro as a baseball player for a while, I thought about it. And he was just a super athletic man. And as some of you may know, once you lose your edge and you can't do things like football and baseball and basketball and so on, many people take up golf because it's still very competitive, it's very hard, but it's not as physically demanding. And I believe Eisenhower was one of the most competitive men ever born. He competed over everything. And it's no accident that he competed so much at cards. He was a world-class bridge player. And it said he had to stop playing poker in the Army because he constantly took all of his buddies' money. And it became an embarrassment, and he just couldn't take their money anymore. So he quit playing poker. But he was a world-class bridge player. The golf was real, and he bet on almost every hole. And you could see in some of the archive, like it'll be like 5 cents. I hit a 92 on that course, you know. And he bet on every hole. I mean, he kept notes. He was not performing anything. He was letting out steam, and that's why he went to Augusta so much. He also liked to shoot guns. He had a very big collection of guns. He had a skeet shooting thing put in at Camp David. He'd go out there, fire blast away at the clay pigeons, and he was a great fisherman. And he had a lot of friends with a lot of big estates where he could do all of those things. I think it might have worked as a performance. But I don't think that's where its origins lay. All right, everyone, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.